Hello, and thank you for joining us today for this CREST panel session about the elements of a good pen test. Our panel of experts from the CREST Pentest Focus Group Subcommittee will be discussing key factors that determine success in electing a pen testing provider. So shortly, I'll be handing over to the panel to introduce themselves, but first, I'd like to let all of our attendees know that there'll be an opportunity for you to ask the panel questions as we're running a Q&A session at the end. So if you think of a question and you don't want to forget it before the Q&A session starts, please type it into the question pane and we'll get those answered at the end. Okay, so yeah, thank you everyone. I'd now like to hand it over to our panel to introduce themselves, starting with Boglaka, please.
Thank you, Rachel. Hi everyone. Hopefully you're having a nice time wherever you are joining from. I head up the global cyber practice within European digital testing and also chair the penetration testing subcommittee that Rachel mentioned just there within CREST. So hopefully together with the other panel members, we can give you a nice entertaining discussion today. It kind of probably makes sense that I've got background in pen testing. I used to do testing for many years before I went into management. So like I said, seen many of the sides of both the buying community and the service provider community. So over to Tony, I believe.
Sounds good. Thanks, Boglaka. Appreciate the opportunity to be in front of everyone. Thanks so much, Rachel, for facilitating this. My name is Tony UC de Velez. I go by Tony UV oftentimes, just a little bit more easier to pronounce. I am the OWASP Atlanta chapter leader. I'm the vice chair to the pen testing subcommittee for CREST. I am an author for risk-centric threat modeling on the PASTA threat modeling methodology, process for attack simulation and threat analysis. And I am the CEO for a cybersecurity firm called VERSPRITE, based out of Atlanta, Georgia. And happy to be here and contribute some of the nefarious thoughts that go into exploit testing, adversarial exercises, and so forth. So thanks for the opportunity to address you all.
Thanks, Tony. I'll pick it up. So hello, everyone. My name is Ben Jacob, and I'm the technical lead for SecureWorks Adversary Group in EMEA. Our team specializes in really all type of offensive security testing, from pen testing to testing wireless, SCADA environment, physical breach or social engineering, up to more complex engagements such as red teaming or purple teaming. On a personal level, I have delivered or had oversight on hundreds of pen test engagements. So hopefully with my experience, I can help others in this call in better understanding various offensive security services. That's it. Back to you, Rachel.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We've got some really great expertise in the panel today. So now we'd like to kick off with our first discussion point, which is defining a pen test. So I'll hand over to you, Boglaka. How would you define a pen test?
All right. Nice, simple topic, right? This is a whole day event, isn't it? We can discuss, we can take some time to discuss it. But obviously, it is an important question. And when you speak to your industry peers, whether you're on the kind of the buying community side or the supplier side, the first thing that usually comes up is, what a pen test, what is it? What is the pen test? What does it contain, or what does it actually mean? And there's been pretty wide interpretations of the concept. There's quite there can be quite different interpretations between different stakeholders. It can be ranging anywhere from a vulnerability scan to, quite specific testing defined as an 80% manual versus 20% automated testing. And the kind of the fact of the matter is that some of this terminology is used interchangeably. So you could easily come across security auditing, security testing, penetration testing, vulnerability analysis, vulnerability scanning, sometimes even red teaming, ethical hacking, of course, and these can all mean the same thing, which sounds a bit bizarre, but it is actually the case. And it will be dependent on the region that you're from. It could just be vocabulary. Using VAPT can be quite common, and it doesn't mean that the kind of the service or the interpretation of the service is not suitable for what you're trying to do. It really just means that there isn't one uniform language or lingo that specifies specifically what a penetration testing is. So what I'd like to do is just for the rest of this discussion, I'll just keep referring to it as pen testing, and I'll try to address all of the different variations of it. And I actually think there's a lot of good guidance out there that on what should and shouldn't be included in a quote-unquote pen test. And some of my fellow panelists are going to be talking about that a little bit later on, so I don't want to steal anyone's thunder. But really, I think very importantly, the question around what a pen test is what you're trying to achieve, and you should be looking at that as a primary focus, primary point, because that will determine where you're going to go with your pen test or with your service. So if you're on the buyer side, it's kind of really easy to think of it like you've got a couple of web apps or a fresh environment that has been set up, and you want to get some testing done to validate whether that's all good, or whether it's any good, or whether there's any improvement needed. And it would be a good idea to get someone to have a look at it. And you should probably be thinking about whether you've set yourself an artificial kind of limitation on just looking at a small piece of the puzzle, or whether what you're trying to look at is holistic enough to give you the outcome that you really need. So there, for example, there could be, if you've got a new environment, there could be a really massive driver to go into production, have your application tested, and you're going to commission a pen test. But very easily there could be a dev version of the same application that is hanging there on the internet, which could represent an attack surface. I'm sure Tony will dive into this. And really, you should be working with your security vendor or supplier to kind of understand if you need to look at that context, that additional context, outside of, we need to go live with this web app, and we need to address the immediate security concerns of the application itself. And there's this kind of a slightly different dimension to this as well. There's a range of standards and rules and regulations that are intended to kind of help with defining what you should be testing for, whether it's down to the scope or whether it's down to the technical delivery side of things. And again, I think the technical piece is something that we will be addressing to some degree later on in the discussion, but the conceptual piece is, or sometimes it can be overlooked a bit. There's going to be some markets that are kind of subject to regulations, right? And there will be rules on what you should be doing, how often you should be doing it, what the scope of that thing should be. Like if you're handling payment card data, you're most certainly going to have to do some PCI ASV scanning on your cardholder data environment. Or if you're a bank, you're likely going to have to do some form of compromise assessment or red teaming or intelligence-led penetration testing on an annual basis. And I'm conscious of the fact that I just introduced 3 new concepts there, so I'm going to try and limit that a little bit. Anyway, what I think we should be looking at here is that usually there can be some unintended consequences around following regulations down to the letter, and the market can respond to regulations in a way that it will converge towards defining minimum services and minimum offerings that will satisfy the regulatory requirements. And sometimes meeting these requirements, these minimum requirements, is still going to leave organizations or parts of the infrastructure exposed. So I think the main takeaway before I go too far down the route of these philosophical questions is that you need to consider the scope and what you're trying to achieve. And it's really important to do that with a wider view on what you're trying to achieve. Don't just think about the immediate objective, like getting that green light or going live with the application. It is obviously important, but think about any potential implications on limiting your testing to that narrow scope. And you probably want to work with like a security vendor. You probably already do have some security vendors that you're working with. You want them to be your trusted advisors, have a more in-depth relationship with them than just transactional one. Get them to become your critical friend to help with making the right decisions and finding the right balance between doing too much testing versus doing too little testing, because both can have these kind of undesired effects. So I think that was kind of an initial interpretation or initial way for me to try and define what a pen test is or what a pen test should be. I'm conscious of the fact that it was relatively vague, but hopefully it's obvious that there's quite a few nuances to this, and it's best that there is an interpretation or an interpretation to the specific requirement that is considered in addition to just like going ahead and running some pen tests. So there's a really good guidance document which addresses the high level piece that I've just covered. It's been released earlier this year. It's called the CREST Defensible Penetration Test. And unlike some of these other technical methodologies which might come up during the call, this is intended to be a guidance for commercial reasonable level assurance activity. So how can you find that balance in defining the scope, in having something delivered and getting the sign off from the business that you need? So highly recommend having a quick look at it, and we can dive into that a bit more later on in the discussion as well. So Rachel, I think I'll hand back to you. Tony, Ben, I don't know if either of you want to comment on some of these things.
Sure, I can jump in real quick. I'm trying to avoid my eyes being exploited right now by this ray of light that seems to want to render me blind. So my eyes are being pen tested right now by the rays of light. But I this is a controversial subject in the InfoSec community, for now CyberSec community. I have more absolute definitions. I mean, penetration testing, pen testing, as short, adversarial testing, exploit testing, is really meant to prove, right? You prove and emulate cyber criminal hacker intent. If we were all part of online cyber criminal gang, we wouldn't even call it penetration or exploit testing. We'd call it hacking. Hack into this, hack into that, and it's so what we're trying to prove now from the perspective of a buyer. There's so many choices out there. And we'll get into the elements of a good pen test a little bit later, but defining a pen test, defining a penetration test should look to prove and exemplify that abuse cases in an application, in a product, in a web application, in a mainframe, in an SAP module, in anything, right? And an embedded firmware has some viability for being taken over, for being introduced arbitrary commands. There's a plethora of different types of possibilities that are pretty malicious that could happen. Exploits depend on proper vulnerability analysis, and this is where you have those cousins that oftentimes get they kind of have an identity crisis, right? So oftentimes when there's a buyer out there that says, I want an exploit test, I want a pen test, and they get a vulnerability analysis, it's it's good to identify possible vulnerabilities, but you want to be able to have someone that's knowledgeable to be able to prove that, right? And that's in the exploit part or the penetration part. So because as a product owner or as a business owner, and if you have technology components that are responsible for the data that is the backbone of your business, then you want to have that assurance. And that's a key term out there in security that's thrown around, that peace of mind that your infrastructure, your product is not going in front of an audience, in front of a community, in front of a client base that could then be a liability because you haven't done enough due diligence, right? So penetration testing has to include is basically the activity of determining whether exploits are feasible and viable against a particular component or product. It does depend on proper vulnerability analysis. You can't go from 0 to 60 by skipping proper vulnerability analysis, but vulnerability analysis, vulnerability assessment alone is not a pen test. Doing port scanning is not a pen test. Doing great OSINT is not a pen test. Open source intelligence gathering is not a pen test. Penetration has to be exemplified in the exercise, and from a commercial consumption buyer community standpoint, you want to be able to demand, show me that you tried to do this. It's okay if you failed, but show me how you tried to do this. And how does your attempts in trying to exploit my product, my web app, my web API, et cetera, how do your attempts reconcile with the best of breed of some of the frameworks that are out there? And that's why, going back to the defensible model put out by CREST, it's really meant to be a way that you can substantiate your pen testing program or pen testing investments, right? So that it's defensible to all your constituents, whether they be internal stakeholders, outside auditors, your clientele that want peace of mind and assurance that you're doing the due diligence for product testing and things like that. But it has to, when you're engaging with pen test providers, the definition of pen testing, penetration testing, exploit testing has to be able to attempt to compromise on identified weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the architecture and native code and third-party libraries, et cetera, anything that makes up that product sandwich. So I'll turn it over to Ben for some closing thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I'll be very quick, but there's, so we've pretty much defined what the pen test is, and some areas that we are trying to solve with a security engagement, a pen test. So we've covered that it needs to reveal kind of security weaknesses in some assets, some external facing assets, some internal facing assets. It can help with compliances mandates as well. Maybe it can be GDPR, it can be a cyber insurance. But a third item as well that I wanted to cover is a pen test can really help with evaluating an organization capabilities to detect and respond to threat actors, right? It's really useful when you have a pen test as a buyer that you gray list the IP addresses of the tester. So yeah, you can see on your security solutions, hey, am I able to detect the attacks that are being sent, the password spraying or the exploits being executed? Am I able to see am I able to see these attacks? And if it was in the real world tomorrow, if it was a real threat actor, would I be able to detect these attacks quickly? So yeah, I think I'm just going to stop it here to ensure we've got enough time for the other questions.
Great, thank you, everyone. Yeah, it certainly sounds like a question with a lot of nuanced answers that we could cover for the entire webinar or even do like a whole day session on. But yeah, for the sake of time, now that our panelists have touched on how you can actually define a pen test, to lead us into our next discussion point, Ben, what would you say to people who are looking to find a good pen test provider?
Right, so yeah, so now we've identified that perhaps you need a pen test as a buyer and you need to find a pen test provider. So the first thing you can do, obviously, is to go on the CREST website, and there is a list of approved pen test companies. So that's great. It's a great first step. However, you'll probably quickly see that there are actually hundreds of accredited companies, which is a good thing. But how do you actually trim it down from hundreds to, let's say, a handful? So well, I've got a few bits of advice here. First is, like most services, whether you need a trade to put a new roof on your house or, a dog walker, word to mouth matter. So it's very, very important that you just contact peers in other organizations, people that you know and that you trust, and ask them, hey, do you have any recommendations about good pen test providers? Because that will give you a pretty easy way to shortlist some suppliers. A second bit of advice is go to InfoSec security conferences. Look at who is participating at the event. Do they have a booth? Do they have people from their company that are perhaps giving presentations? Do they have a strong research and development process? Do they perform capture the flag events or participate or even host them? And that's a lot of factors really that will help you get a better understanding of the culture of an organization. And we all know that in InfoSec there is pretty much a lack of talent in the industry. And if you want to find a good pen test provider, you want to find where the talents are, and it's important to know that the culture of an organization will attract talent. Another thing to trimming down from hundreds to just a handful of providers is to try to think in advance about what kind of security services you might need in the upcoming year. So for example, you might just need a pen test. That's possible. That's the only thing you need. So maybe a boutique provider that specializes in this industry or that activity may be enough. But otherwise, you may be able to, you might need other services. Maybe you need an incident response retainer just in case you get breached. Maybe you need, a threat intel feed, just to see if any threat actor is targeting companies in your business vertical. And you see where I'm going there, right? It's generally easier to buy a suite of packages from one organization, assuming they are good at delivering all of the services, of course. You may get actually a better value if you make a larger purchase than just a single purchase. Right, so now we're trimming down to hundreds of companies to, let's say, a handful. So you're probably going to have to reach to this company with an RFP. And I'm not going to give you like a detailed bullet list of all the questions that needs to be on an RFP. Otherwise, we'll probably be here all day as well. But just a few points to think about really. The first one is what's the average experience of a pen test and a pen tester in that organization? Because the more experienced the tester are, the better technical and consulting skills that they will have. The second point is to make sure to understand, we've discussed kind of a little bit that in the first question, but to understand the methodology used by the supplier. Are they really giving you a pen test? Are you giving you a VA? Understand really what will be happening during the engagement and ask them to provide a report sample because, that you actually see what kind of deliverable will be handed to you after the engagement. Another couple of things is that Bob Larka actually touched a little bit on already, but make sure that the scoping is accurate because, for example, I've seen a lot of RFPs coming through and the buyer is saying, hey, we've got 5 web apps that needs to be tested. Can you please give us a price? And actually they get prices from various suppliers, that can be, a variety of prices without really knowing any of the details of the web apps that needs to be tested, right? They don't know about the complexity, number of static or dynamic pages, don't know the number of rows. And all of these details are kind of important to ensure that the assessment is scoped correctly and that the consultant will have enough time to do a thorough job. And finally, obviously money does matter, right? But it should probably be one of the last thing to consider. As for any service, really, or any trade, I'm coming back to my roofing company. I would rather pay a little bit more to get quality material and experienced people to install these materials, rather than pay a little bit less and have a false sense of security. So it's kind of critical to understand what value you get for a specific price point. And just to close on this one, before I pass it on, a lot of companies will have after a year or a couple of years, they have a policy to rotate pen test provider, which is completely fine. And obviously, they need to have a look again after a year or after a couple of years to select a new supplier. And one of the great thing is to contact. If you have someone in the field, if you are really happy with the company or pen tester that you had an engagement in the past, just contact them, get in touch with them, and ask them directly, who do you think will deliver similar value or even better value than you did? Because these guys, the pen tester, will have some peers in other organizations that they can recommend that will be beneficial for you. Right, so that was quite a bit of information, but I'll pass it to Boglarka now.
Good stuff, thank you. I think there's quite a bit to unpack there.
Yeah.
I think one of the areas that you covered, in particular on the rotating of pentest suppliers. I mean, it is important to have a list of trusted partners, and like you said, it's completely fine to have that, to work with multiple providers. It's an interesting point I've been thinking about a couple of days ago. Is it better when when you've got a requirement to do a retest, for example? Is it better to invite the same person that did the original test, or is it better to have someone with a fresh pair of eyes have a look at it? And you can really find arguments both ways, right? And it's the same with your security vendors that you're working with. You do want to have the element of trust, but occasionally it's beneficial to have another pair of eyes. So I just wanted to kind of quickly make that comment. But otherwise, absolutely agree with what you've been saying.
Yeah, just round out the discussion on this. I just really ask the audience to understand that in pen testing and shopping for services, it's a whole range of spectrum of capabilities, price points, and overall expertise in the global market of providers for sure. And I would say the majority of the market is masquerading pen testing as something else. So buyer beware and do your homework. And there's a lot of information and frameworks out there, fortunately, to be able to make for an educated buyer. So how do you simplify this? Well, one of my favorite questions when I first started in the business many, many, many moons ago was during an interview. This was actually to be a part of an adversarial team. I was talking to a director of research, and they said, "Hey, how would you hack this place?" And I was in this was back in the historical realm when we actually went into offices. But you need to be able to, what is the reason? First, ask yourself, what is the reason that you are actually procuring pen testing services? So understand that. Is it because you're checking off? And there's nothing wrong with checking off boxes. It's part of business, right? Somebody is asking you to have some level of artifact to show that you have thought about product security and things like that. So compliance is, what we call the dirty C word here at VERSPRITE, but it's a necessary evil. And if you think about the altruistic nature of laws and regulation and compliance, there is legislation that is meant to say we have to do something, right? So it's not entirely evil, even though I kind of poke fun at it many times. But what is your driver for doing exploit testing? Is it truly to find that your product that's going to get shipped out that might actually provide some level of support to patients, to pilots in aviation, et cetera, has some level of assurance and resiliency against some sort of attack? If so, then you really want to do your homework on the capabilities of your pen testing partner. And I notice I said the word partner there because they really have to be a partner in understanding your product or services that you have out there. Vendors, there's a lot of. Partners, there's very few. And as you're basically evaluating that landscape, if your goal and motivation is really product resiliency and assurance, then it's really important that you understand the capabilities and approach of your pen testing partner. Now, if the main driver is that you're caught in a go-to-market strategy and you are basically trying to have some level of assurance for an auditor, there's some level of evidence that says that you need to be able to do something for, let's say, the payment card industry data security standard, as an example. There's nothing wrong with being able to, that opens up, I think, the capability pool, because doing that type of work, typically from the mindset of the professional, pen testing for compliance is completely different for hacking, for exploitation, persistence, compromise, etc. Different motives. So you as a buyer have to understand what you're getting into and what are your drivers, and that should help to determine. But overall, speaking on the point of product resiliency and product assurance, if you are trying to evaluate a good pen test provider, they have to understand your product. One of the questions I'll close with this is, when I talk to people that I interviewed to bring in from an adversarial standpoint, I always ask them kind of a double-edged sword question. I ask them, well, what is one of your favorite websites that you like to go to? One of your favorite products? And then I have them kind of share their passion about how they visit the product, how they visit the online experience. And then I say, okay, well, tell me how you would hack it. Because if you know your product so well, you should be able to know how you would defeat it. And that mindset is extremely rare to find in the people that you employ in a pen testing partner. So buyer beware, do your homework. And, I definitely subscribe to a lot of the things that were already mentioned by, Ben and Boglarka. Back to you, Rachel.
Great, thank you. So I'm actually going to throw the next topic back to you, Tony. So I think next we're going to talk about the non-negotiables when it comes to approaching a pen test. So yeah, Tony, if you could share some non-negotiables for our audience, please.
Absolutely. Okay. So the lens on this, so the non-negotiables for employing pen testing, I'm trying to put on so many different hats here because I'm thinking about the panelists and the listeners that might be listening to this a week, 2 weeks later, that are in healthcare, higher education, retail, government. And so the lens, of non-negotiables is difficult to compact it into just that sweet nectar of like, what are things that you have to have, right? And so if I were to basically chalk up some non-negotiables, I would begin with number one, scope. In a good pen test, scoping really determines a lot. It determines on the success of the overall pen testing engagement. It determines on proper time management on both sides, right? Too big of a scope can be overzealous, especially when combined with too little time. So understand that when you are procuring for pen testing services, and as compared to the real pen testers or hackers that are out there that have like months to hack into your product, you are having to architect an engagement model that properly defines scope in a way that is realistic and obtainable for your partner, right? For your pen testing partner. And that's going to, unfortunately, scope can oftentimes influence price. So as a buyer, now empathizing with the buyer mindset, when you basically, say, well, I want to have a really good scope on this, which means that you have a pretty good budget. Because if you're pen testing a product for a week versus pen testing a product for a month, your price point is going to be totally different. So how do you really determine what to scope in? Well, shamelessly, I am going to introduce the topic of threat modeling. And the idea with a risk-centric threat model is that what helps define the scope is to say, what are you protecting against, right? So if I am a software vendor that provides a hardware component with embedded firmware into, for example, airplanes, right? I have to think of like, what is the threat objective of an adversarial individual to be able to do, let's say, supply chain hack and get into that airplane, that Boeing, that Airbus, et cetera. And what is the ultimate goal? Is it creating some sort of like, persistence in the aircraft, So I begin to define these libraries, and then these libraries of threats begin to have a supporting branches of attack patterns. And that helps to define the scope of what I want to have accomplished in, my adversarial testing of whatever's going to go into my aircraft, right? This example can be done for every single industry that's out there, but, bubbling it back up, scope is so paramount. Number two, use cases. And this kind of goes along with scope, but it's a little bit more refined in the sense of like if we're, again, just waving the magic wand here, we're all hackers, we're all nefarious minded, and we all want to break into somewhere. You can't do that if you do not understand use case and function. Just going back to physical crime, most physical criminals that are going into establishments, buildings, etc., they have to understand, how environments are built, how they're structured, ingress, egress of places, people traffic, who's working where and when, in order so that they can do perpetration and a slew of other things. So understanding function is so important. So that's element number two. Make sure that your use cases that are so important, especially to your product and to your business, get really front and center as you're scoping out what to test. Okay, so number three is proper vulnerability weakness analysis. When most people think about that, they just think of like, CVEs and CWEs. Nothing wrong with those taxonomies for MITRE, great libraries of weakness and vulnerabilities. However, for most practitioners, that's their box, right? They just live in that box. And so when we talk about vulnerability and weaknesses, it's not, first of all, understand that CVEs and CWEs combined, equating to hundreds of thousands of a library, is still not the full realm of possibilities of what could be weak or vulnerable within your application or product. And then secondly, many of those different types of identifiers don't have known exploits tied to them. So what you want to have is making sure that your vulnerability and weakness analysis goes beyond the embedded software, the native software that you're writing or having written, outsourced, whatever, but also in the architecture. Everyone forgets about the architecture, right? The design of the overall app. So all that has to be encompassed into, good vulnerability, weakness analysis. And that is I would say, a major ingredient in exploit testing. Years ago, I saw this infographic, and if you can imagine like a spectrum, just a linear spectrum, like a rectangle, if you will, and denoting like time blocks, the smallest part, and this comes up to my fourth point of non-negotiables in pen testing, which is exploitation. The smallest part of that time graph or that time infographic was actually the exploitation side. If you do good use case analysis and vulnerability analysis, that's where you spend the bulk of your time. That should automatically give you good insight as a tester in terms of where you're going to focus your exploitation efforts. So that's surprising for a lot of people. People think, oh, you spend a lot more time in exploitation. Well, if you do your use case analysis right, if you do your vulnerability analysis right, you're going to hone in sniper rifle style and be able to say, well, let me leverage these existing exploits, these known attack patterns, or maybe begin some net new attempts for, discovering a new attack pattern that hasn't been discovered. Now that does take a lot of time, but that's really dipping into, end day exploitation or 0-day exploitation on a particular product. Last two things really quick. So just to recap where we are: scope, use cases, vulnerability, weakness analysis. Don't forget the architecture on that. Exploitation. The last two are remediation guidance and retesting. So remediation guidance, anyone can find and tell you your baby's ugly, baby being a metaphor for your product or application. That's not hard to do. I mean, finding what's wrong is not the hard part. Knowing how to fix it is the hard part, and not just providing one solution. You want to have a good partner. You want to make sure that they're going to give you options. Here's why. Maybe you work for an enterprise and you don't actually own the native code, right? You're just dependent on that some third party, fourth party vendor that provides something in your environment, and you are inheriting that security debt, that ugly baby. Remediation guidance should, encompass architectural design patterns, network countermeasures, platform countermeasures, infrastructure countermeasures, and of course, native code remediation countermeasures that could be applied. Last but not least, retesting. Retesting, I think, is something that, when I I started out in IT, in IS, information security, over the past 27 years. So retesting really wasn't kind of one of those components when you did a traditional pen test going back 15, 20 years ago. But retesting now is really important, and you get a lot more value because, again, going back to finding what's wrong, you want to have a partner that says, I'm going to give you some time to fix this. And typically retest models provide some level of a time frame where you and your product team can go and actually fix the problems found by your able pen testing partner. And then they can go back and validate that the remediation that you applied actually works. So it's so important to be able to, have these, 6 components thrown in there: scope, use cases, vulnerability analysis, exploitation, remediation, guidance, and retesting. But this is, what I would consider to be the non-negotiables. And there could be other non-negotiables as you look into different sectors, in military and government and healthcare and transportation. So, but hopefully this was helpful. And then just wanted to get the thoughts from the panel.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Yeah, I agree with your points. I think maybe just one that I want to quickly add is in terms of the methodology, right? In the technical methodology, in the pen test, in my eyes, in terms of non-negotiable, is that it won't be 100% automated. A pen test is not a vulnerability assessment, and it must include some kind of manual analysis of the issues discovered. And on a similar line, what the pen test must include as well is that when a tester is reviewing vulnerabilities, not to review them in silo, but try to make to relate them to one another, right? We kind of call that like creating a kill chain. So just to give you a brief example, you are on we are an external pen test. We are scanning, the IPs of his customers, and we might find, a vulnerability in one app that discloses a username that the company is using. We can use that information to then feed that information to a password spray to perform a password spray of a portal. Maybe we get valid credentials, and then with that valid credential, we can try to bypass MFA. So again, it's a multiple issues that are combined together to find a kill chain, and that's kind of where the manual testing add a lot of value compared to just the automated testing.
Agree, Ben. And also the other reason why we obviously go on and on stressing that the manual element is important is because there will always be functions and test cases that you can't really automate, or you can automate it, but you might as well have gone on to do it manually, because it can be a logic flaw in an application, which, if you're looking at it from an automation point of view, the web page will load, whether it will load content that is appropriate for that user, or whether you were able to access to do horizontal privilege escalation and access the data belonging to another user. It would be really, really difficult to automate that. I'm not saying it's impossible, but these are the types of issues that a tester will evaluate as they go through their journey of the application logic and of the potential logical flaws affecting the application, also infrastructure. So that's probably one of the key aspects of why we're stressing it. And Tony went on to obviously look at this. And Tony, you mentioned, the CVEs and the CWEs. Absolutely. And I think very often the security industry stops at identifying vulnerabilities and doesn't labor enough on weaknesses, because weaknesses can equally represent an attack surface, especially if you have the ability to combine some of the weaknesses with some of the vulnerabilities. And you can very easily end up with a pen test that highlighted a couple of low and medium risk findings that you actually have a route to exploit through combining those elements or those findings.
All right, thank you, everyone. So our final discussion point is about the key factors that take a pen test from being a good pen test to a great pen test. So that we have enough time for a Q&A at the end, perhaps we can do a quickfire round this time where each of our panelists share one key factor that you each think make for a great pen test. So maybe 1 to 2 minutes on each. So who wants to kick off with this one? Maybe Ben, do you want to go first on this one?
Sure, yeah, I'll pick it up. So yeah, in my eyes, what makes a great pen test is obviously the consulting approach. It's all about who is performing that test. Little things like having a kickoff call before the test so that the consultant and the customer or the buyer can be on the same page about the scope, about the goals of the engagements. Little things like sending daily emails. The consultant can send daily emails about their progress through the engagements. So that the buyer on the other hand or the customer can kind of try to track their activity and try to track, well, am I seeing the type of attacks that are being sent by the consultants? That adds a lot of value as well. And finally, what also can make a great pen test is to, at the end of the engagement, not just sending the report through and calling it a day. I find it very valuable when there's a debrief meeting with a walkthrough of the report to make sure that the buyer has actually or the customer has actually understood exactly what was the issue and what's the remediation process. So yeah, in my eyes, what makes a great pen test is a consulting approach. I'll pass it to Boglarka, I guess, or Tony, up to you guys.
Yeah, why not? Yeah. I think I always like to approach these things from a human perspective, right? Whether you're on the buyer side or you're on the supplier side, it's important to recognize that you're on a journey. Everyone's on a journey. If you're a buyer, you're on a journey. You're looking to improve yourself. You're looking to improve your security posture. If you're a vendor, you're looking to improve the offerings that you're providing and make yourself stickier with customers. Whatever your driver or motivation is, the way to go from good to great is that you ask for feedback. You ask for feedback from your customers, you ask for feedback from your vendors or from your stakeholders within the business. And that feedback is going to help inform your decisions and your strategy, regardless of, like I said, whether you're on the buyer or the vendor side. And equally applies to both. You want to look at finding ways to incentivize desired behavior in your team. You're going to have a security team. If you're in the buying community, you're going to want to find ways of getting them to work or cultivate a really good collaborative culture. If you're on the security vendor side, you want to continue to explore, continue to invest in R&D, continue to punch higher, stay on top of the trends. And yeah, just cultivate that culture of awesomeness within the hacking community.
Yeah, one of the things I'll add is, one of the things we haven't really talked about, like the nature of different types of pen testing engagements, like black box, gray box, white box, and things like that. But just really quickly, you have to pick a model that's right for you. But going from a good and average pen test, which will encompass a lot of the things that we've talked about. If you're going to go to great, again, you're going to encompass some things that go beyond like a framework or a methodology. Ask yourself, audience members, whether or not you think a cyber criminal is using a framework or a methodology. And I can guarantee you that the answer is actually going to be no, they're not. What they're doing 100% is understanding the use cases of your product. And that's what they're understanding. That is their approach because they have a goal, and their goal, time is of the essence for them as well. They want persistence. They want malware upload. They want to do extortion. These are the realistic goals that we, as on the white hat side of things, want to be able to exemplify through pen testing engagements. So threat modeling takes a step back and say, what am I actually protecting here? Like, what is my application doing? And what's at stake? Those three major questions, and that's more of a risk-centric approach. So leverage a threat model to provide a blueprint. And this is going to really, what's it going to do is going to do a couple of things. Number one, it's going to contextualize your pen testing engagement to those three things that I mentioned. What am I doing? What am I protecting? What's really at stake? Number two, it's going to make it more collaborative because it's going to force things that you would normally not actually open up the kimono and have conversations across the aisle on like related to architecture. When you do threat modeling and you start to think about what's the worst that could happen, you start to open up dialogues with your architect, with platform engineers, with infrastructure engineers, engineering components that might sit below your product as a product manager, right? So the threat modeling aspect will definitely make the overall scoping better. It'll define what types of attack patterns or exploits in the kill chain that you want to exemplify in an exercise. And then, so it also will make it more collaborative. And that, is what we see has been really a true game changer, because it contextualizes the importance of the pen test and what comes out of it for absolutely all the stakeholders that are there. But the other thing that I think what bears emphasis is definitely on the manual exploitation side of things. It's definitely going to be more costly. Don't go into the market thinking that they talked about manual exploitation, so it should be this should be done by everybody. The reality is that good manual exploitation is done by very few. And so, but it's all going to come down to budget. Not everyone can go and sit down for a 5 diamond restaurant. Some of them want to go and have Chipotle. Pen testing prices range from as low as like $4,000 to upwards to hundreds of thousands of dollars for an application, even some that are monolithic and some that are modular. So in closing, I would say that applying an application threat model as a blueprint for penetration testing, in addition to a lot of the recommendations made collectively, is going to basically be a game changer for going from good to great.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. So now we have a few minutes left, about 7 minutes left for a Q&A session. So everyone attending, if you'd like to ask our panelists a question, if you want to pop it in the Q&A pane right now, then we'll try and get that answered for you. But to kick off with, we've had a question through that Ben has kindly replied to in the question pane, but I think it'd be great to ask again in case it benefits the rest of our audience. And Boglaka or Tony might have some comments to add. So Ben, if you're able to take this one initially, the question is, do you have any tips or advice to help mitigate against scope creep during an engagement?
Yeah, so I mean, what I've replied to the person posting this question is that, well, first, the statement of work is what we tester live and die from. So it's extremely important that statement of work is actually accurate and describe, what the scope of the engagement. And then, if there's any assets that are out of bound, which sometimes they are, the vast majority of my engagements actually, try to include everything rather than it's bad to have out-of-bound scope because this machine or the system may be used by real-world threat actors. However, it is understood that some machines, if you do a simple Nessus scan against them, you might crash them and cause disruptions in an organization. So it is understood that maybe there needs to be out of scope just to avoid causing any disruptions. In that case, it just needs to be made clear before the engagement that the buyer speak with the tester to make sure that, hey, that are out of scope, they will cause disruptions, please don't touch them, and that it's understood on both sides.
Great, thank you. Tony, do you have something to add?
Well, yeah, I mean, scope creep happens. It's a horrible thing, especially for the provider. I mean, it just throws a complete curveball and everything comes crashing down. There's a lot of gnashing of teeth on the pen testing side of things, but we have to understand why did the pen test scope creep happen, right? Was it because we had a pivotal person on the customer side that was absent during the initial response of the scoping questionnaire? Typically, pen test providers have a scoping questionnaire to understand a little bit about the application or the product or the network. And so when someone comes in from assumingly from like left field and says, wait a minute, I have these 10 extra API endpoints that are so pivotal. I think at the end of the day, it comes down to that word that I said before, right? That partnership, right? Now accepting those extra 10 API endpoints, which is a lot, because with every API endpoint, you could have literally hundreds of methods that you're having to now validate and go through, different types of testing, authenticated testing with different types of user roles. So it's a lot of work. So I think it's going to vary. The answer is, and it's a classic, I hate this answer, but it depends, right? So understand the source and the reason for the scope creep. If the scope creep was because some level of irresponsibility, then you have to be able to make the buyer accountable and say, listen, we've time gapped this. Here's our focus. In order to make this great, we have to excel with what we have, and then maybe we can basically chain that as a separate focus and scope for afterwards. However, if time is of the essence, then it's important to understand that what the rationale was and to see if there's any sort of flexibility with the partner to be able to see if they can, add an additional team, have a B team, and not a B team as in terms of like a deprecated team group, but just a separate team to be able to focus on that separate scope. There's always different ways where you can kind of carve out and do and accommodate those sort of scope creeps. They're just, in 20 plus years of InfoSec, they are unfortunately a thing that happens, all the time. But I would say it goes back to understanding, why did the scope creep happen, and going to the partner. What can my partner, that's a true partner, right? Do they have the flexibility to be able to accommodate? And then usually if a company and a partner are on the same terms, that company then knows for the next time, okay, I cannot do this again. They did me a solid, right? And they were able to accommodate, but next time, and they also have to understand that scope creep could introduce consequences to the integrity of the current test that's being done. But those are my thoughts.
All right, thank you. So I think we might have time for just one last question, if you've all got time. So we've had a question come through. Is there a benefit in sharing previous pen test reports with the vendor? Maybe Boglarka, you might want to take that one.
Yeah, I can do. I'm gonna kind of side with Tony and say it depends, and it kind of goes back to one of the points that I made earlier. In some scenarios, it can be beneficial for you to engage with a new partner and get them to bring a fresh pair of eyes. Now, if that is the intention, then you're probably kind of sorry, what's the right word? So if your intention is to bring in a fresh pair of eyes, you're just working against yourself if you share the outcome of a previous test, because you want someone to bring a different approach, a different way of thinking, a different way of viewing things, and that can be tainted by sharing previous results, because that will inevitably just cement the direction of the tester's thinking. So in that case, if that's your intention, don't share the report. If your intention is to have some level of continuity, because you're already pretty far on the maturity chart, and you've tested your application or your infrastructure multiple times, you're testing it through a SecDevOps piece during the building of the application, you're testing it as it went into the initial staging environment, and so on and so forth, then you probably do want to make your vendor aware of any kind of previous findings, because what you don't want them is to spend time identifying risks that you might have already decided to accept. So it does depend, but you just have to think about in the context of what you're trying to achieve. Does it make sense? Is it going to be more beneficial to do that, or are you going to just work against yourself by doing that? So there's no right or wrong way. Just think about what's best in that particular scenario.
All right, thank you. And I think that is all we have time for today. So if anyone has a question that they want answered later on, then feel free to drop us an email at marketing@crest-approved.org, and we can pass it on to our panelists. Massive thank you to our panel today. Did a fantastic job. And thank you to everyone for attending. If you want to subscribe to the CREST YouTube channel, and then you can watch a recording of this later on if you missed anything. So yeah, thank you very much. And we will wrap this up for today.
Sounds good. Thanks, Rachel. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.